Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the Anschutz 9015, and what we're going to be doing in this one is rebuilding the rifle. We're going to be starting off at the front with the regulator, then working our way back. Before we start, I'll just quickly run through the O-ring sizes in the regulator just so you've got them. The one that's on the bottom of the piston and on this brass piece here is a 7.5 by 1.5, and the one on the outer body of the regulator, so these two here, are 15 by 1.5s. And finally, these two green ones here are 4 by 1.5s, although they are a special material, so it's not just a regular O-ring dyed green, but you can get these O-rings direct from Anschutz. And if you bought your rifle new, you should have a spare in your box. But with that said, we can start the rebuild. So first thing we'll do is just add a small amount of silicone grease to this bottom O-ring here. Then in this brass piece here, we're going to drop the plunger. Black side down, so small pin side down. Give that a little shake to make sure it's seated. Then we'll drop the spring over the top of it. Just make sure that the spring goes over the plunger. Then we'll screw this top piece down. Doing that up nice and tight with just a flat bladed screwdriver. This does need to be done up extra tight, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grip this brass section here in a collet block and then give it a final tweak to make sure it's done up nice and tight. So I'll be right back. With that nice and tight, we can take the O-ring, stick a little bit of silicone grease over it, wiping off the excess, and we can push that over the base there. Then we can install that in this tube here, screwing it in and then tightening it up using a flat bladed screwdriver. Getting it nice and tight. Once that's done, we can put the little locking set screw in. So this is a set screw, a very small one, that uses a 0.9mm Allen key to do up. From the factory it does have some kind of sealant in there, although I'm not going to be putting any sealant on mine, as it's very unlikely to come loose under normal use, and adding any sealant on there will make it a little more difficult to get undone in the future. The next thing we can do is drop the regulator piston in the back of the hole. So first off, just adding a small amount of silicone grease to the O-ring on the base, and then dropping that in the hole. So long shaft or long side of the reg piston points upwards. Just getting that nice and seated on the base there. Then we take our Belleville washers. So this is the stack that was present in my rifle. It's 2 cupped one way, 2 cupped the other way, and then the final two, these two here, are cupped in the same direction facing towards the adjuster screw. So just going to put the cocktail stick on the piston, tip the stack up and get that on the end there like so. And then finally we'll take our adjuster screw and do that up using a 5mm Allen key. And last thing we've got to do is set the reg pressure by adjusting this screw here. Now I don't have a reg tester for this rifle, but we did take the measurement when we took it apart. So the distance from the screw to this top face here was roughly 1.5 to 1.6mm, depending on where you took the measurement. So that time it was 1.2. Do a couple more turns in. So there's 1.5, 1.57, so we're roughly about where we were before. 1.51 again, so I'm happy with that. The next thing we can do is install the regulator into the front block. So first thing I'm going to do is remove this grub screw in the bottom. That will just allow me to see when we're in the right place for the regulator. Next we'll take our reg body, put a small amount of silicone grease around these O-rings here, wiping off the excess, and then we can push the regulator into the hole. So it goes in this way with this grub screw dimple to the bottom, and once it's in there we'll just make sure that the grub screw dimple lines up with this hole here, which it does on my rifle. and we can do that up with a 2.5mm Allen key. Do that up nice and tight. And there we have the regulator installed back in the rifle. So we'll put the front block to one side and bring back the rear half of the block. And the first thing we're going to reinstall is the stabiliser unit. And this is the stabiliser unit that was fitted to my rifle. I believe it's Anschutz's newest design and the one they describe as the maintenance-free stabiliser system. So I'll just give a very brief explanation of how it works. In the back we have this sort of steel weight which is arrested on this clip in the back here. Now it's able to pull loose from this clip fairly easily, although it won't fall out of its own accord. If we look in the end here, don't know how well the camera's going to pick that up, but you should see there a microscopic little hole in the very end. So when this is installed in the rifle and working correctly, we would have the barrel sitting in the nose here, sealed against this O-ring in the end. We also have the transfer port on the bottom, so as we take a shot, air travels into the transfer port and obviously pushes the pellet out the end of the barrel. At the same time, a small amount of air is able to pass through that little hole and push this stabiliser weight off the clip, absorbing some of the recoil. So what you in effect have is the backwards force from the pellet being pushed up the barrel being countered by the movement of this little weight here. It's not a 100% perfect system, but it does a very good job of negating any possible aftershock recoil of the 9015. And it's definitely the deadest rifle I've ever shot. And even with a 50 times magnification scope, you see very little recoil after you take your shot. This particular stabiliser doesn't really have any adjustment. The only adjustment you do have is this little roller ball bearing in the side here. If you use an Allen key from this side, it's a 2mm Allen key, so if you use a Allen key from this side, you can adjust the position of this roller ball bearing here. So the further out that you have it, the more contact with the inside of the stabiliser unit that this weight has. So it in effect increases the amount of drag. What I like to do is get the roller ball bearing just over flush, so there's a small amount of resistance when the weight is put in the housing itself. That gets you near enough, and then when you've got the rifle set up on the bench and with a scope on it, you can fine adjust the roller ball bearing when it's actually in the gun to get it exactly where you need it to be. But with that all said and done, we can put it back in the rifle now. And the first thing we're going to do is just add a tiny little bit of moly grease to the outside of the stabiliser unit. You don't want any grease on the inside, but the outer sheath here we can put a little bit of moly grease over, just so it slides in and out the block nice and smoothly. A very light smear will do you. Just wipe the excess off with our fingers. And obviously making sure that we don't get any on the actual weight of the stabiliser, so this silver part of the stabiliser. Next thing we'll do, you just slide it in the block of the rifle like so, nice and carefully, pushing it to roughly in place. The next thing we'll do is connect this arm. So from the top there, get the holes lined up, and then we'll drop the pin in, flip the arm over, and then we've got to put a little C-clip or C-clip on the base there. So the easiest way I've found to do these is just get the C-clip into position, like so, and then using an Allen key or something similar, just pop the C-clip into position, like so. Next up, while we're on this side, what we'll do next is put the little hammer spring arrestor in. So this piece here just stops the hammer spring shuttle from rotating when it's in the rifle. We'll drop that in the hole like so, and using a Phillips head screwdriver we'll do that up nice and tight. Next up, I'm going to put the front half of the block on. So we'll bring back the front block and the little transfer port block, as well as the valve pin and the valve return spring. First thing we'll do is drop the valve return spring back in the plenum chamber, like so, making sure that the Spring actually goes over the guide rod there. Then we'll put the little O-ring that goes in this hole here. So this is a 10 by 1 O-ring. Before that goes in, we are just going to add a small amount of silicone grease over it and place that back in the hole. Next up, we're going to put the valve pin in this little transfer port block here. Nice and carefully like so. And this part just slides in the front half of the rifle. Once that's done, we can marry the two halves of the block, just making sure that this boss of the valve here actually hooks onto the spring, like so. I don't know if you could see it from your angle, but I did see the valve marry up with the spring. Do have to make sure of that, as they can be misaligned if you're not careful. Next we'll drop all the screws into the holes, and then whilst pushing down on the block, we're just going to get all the screws started. Now that we have the screws started, we can have a look at the block and make sure that there's no gap between the two blocks in these sides here. The front block and the rear block have an aligning peg that needs to be put in the hole. It's very hard to get it misaligned, but just make sure that they're nice and aligned as you put it together. Then we can go round with a 3mm Allen key, just tightening the bolts up. So very quickly off camera, what I've done is just put the block on a surface plate and made sure that the dovetails are nice and aligned so that it's sitting flat on a nice flat surface. And now that that's done, we can do the bolts up to final torque. With that done, we can flip the block over, or flip the rifle over, and we can drop the hammer in the back here. So in this hole here, drop the hammer through, just give it a little shake to get it down to where it needs to be. And before the trigger goes in, we'll make sure that the hammer is fully home. So make sure that your rifle is on fire mode, then push the hammer down until you can actually feel it hitting the valve. Next we can drop the trigger in place. So these two screws here, the long ones, little button heads, hold the trigger into the rifle. And what we've got to do is line up these holes here with the pin and the screw. Just drop it in place, give it a little wiggle to make sure it's in the right place, get the screws started, then make sure the trigger plate is nice and flush on the actual block itself. If the hammer's in the wrong position, too far forward or too far back, the trigger won't go down flat. You may end up damaging the sear if you do the screw up with the trigger in the wrong position. But for now, we can just do that up using a 2mm Allen key, like so. Next up, we'll drop the hammer spring in the back. So the hammer spring has this slot cut out in the side, which aligns with this side with this little cover piece here. So put that in the back there, push it down into the hole, get that where it needs to be. And then finally we can mount the cocky linkage. So this is the first part that goes on. It hooks on the back of the hammer spring in this hole here using this peg, and the front half goes up like so. Before the front part goes on, I am just going to add a very small amount of moly grease to this surface here, just so it slides on the block, or the aluminium of the block, nice and easily. You really don't want any grease or anything in the hammer way, as that can cause you inconsistencies, or I've found it to cause inconsistencies. So I always keep my hammers dry. Next up we can put the top plate on. Now it's important to line that hole up with the right position, so this hole here, line it up so that both the holes align, and then move the cocking arm back so that this slot here in the side of the stabiliser is nice and exposed. Drop the two pieces over each other like so, then using a thin Allen key we can align the linkages, get them where they need to be, like so. So now the plate is flat, we see it's in the right position. So what you're trying to do there, by using an Allen key and fishing through that hole is align this hole with the top. So just line that up again, drop that over the front there, use an Allen key just to get it where it needs to be. Now everything's working and moving as it should. Next up we can just install the screws. So your one will have Phillips head screws, but I replaced it on mine with Allen headed ones. So get them installed and then done up using a 2.5mm Allen key. Next up what we're going to do is stick the stabiliser cap back in the back. So it's this piece here. What I like to do with this is just do it in till it stops, or just past flush I should say, like so, and then bring the cocking arm back. Now at the moment there, the cocking arm isn't pulling the hammer back far enough to latch it onto the trigger sear, so what we need to do is just very slightly loosen this sort of quarter a turn at the time whilst pulling up on the cocking arm just till we find the point which the hammer latches. So still a bit more, still a little more. There we have it there. You hear a faint click when the hammer latches on the trigger sear. So when that happens we're just going to go an additional quarter of a turn, and that's the stabiliser set. Then we can stick the little locking grub screw in the side here to stop that coming undone with the vibrations of the rifle. The next thing we can do is install the air tank. So bring the air tank over, install that in the front there. Now we're going to get to about here, then what I'm going to do is cock the rifle, and this will take any preload off the front of the valve. We have pressure in the cylinder and we're getting no leaks on the rifle, so we know we've put everything back together properly. I am just going to flick it on trigger training mode and decock the rifle. And then we'll bring the barrel back. So the only change I'd made to the barrel was I turned down this little relief here in the where the grub screws go, just so that as we do the grub screws up, if we do throw up any burrs, they don't scratch the inside of the front block. The other thing I've done, if you look at the front here, is I've cut the front shroud, or the back of the shroud, back a little bit, as I think it was touching the block in my rifle, as there's a couple silver marks if you look very closely. In the end there, I think that this stainless steel outer shroud piece was touching the block, so I just cut that back a little. But we can stick the barrel in. Like so. And obviously before you put the barrel in, make sure that your grub screws either side are nice and loose. So the way I set my barrels is that I just bring them back till they touch the stabiliser, put the rifle on like a nice flat surface, then whilst pushing the barrel downwards slightly, do up the two grub screws in the side. That's the other one. That's using a 3mm Allen key. Once that's done, what we'll do is we'll fire the rifle in a nice safe direction and check for any leaks around the breech area. So I'm happy with that. There's no leaks. We've put a pellet in there and we can't feel any air escaping as we fire the rifle. If you did have a leak after doing it that way, it would be worth checking the O-ring in the front of the stabiliser there. That's a 7.5 by 1.5mm O-ring, and if it was leaking, or leaking when you fired the rifle, you would need to check that O-ring and replace it if necessary. The other thing that's important to check is the position of the front of the stabiliser unit, so the transfer port side of the stabiliser unit. If we look down here, we see the transfer port in the block, and the stabiliser unit, we see over the end there, has to come up and seal against that transfer port in order to allow the air to go through the barrel, push the pellet out the end without any leaks. Now you can alter the position, so how far forward or how far back this part goes in relation to the rifle itself. That's done by adjusting this small cam in the back. So we'll take that out and I'll show you exactly how that works. First though, we're going to have a look on the front here. If we just rub our finger across it, put a little bit of oil on it, put the stabiliser forward, then just give a small amount of pressure on the front there. We should be able to see, I don't know if the camera will pick that up, but there's a ring where that seal is sealing on the transfer port. So we can see there that it's nice and in the middle. It's not exactly in the middle, but it is sealing all the way around the hole. If that wasn't the case and it wasn't sealing all the way along the hole, we would need to adjust this cam here. So I'll just decock the rifle and we'll take that off and I'll show you exactly how that works. So we need to remove this C-clip here. What we'll do first, we'll just open the cocking arm. That will remove some of the tension on the pin itself, make it a little easier to remove. Then using a flat bladed screwdriver or something nice and thin, we're going to just push the C-clip off the end there. We see, remove the C-clip and the pin fell out the bottom. So if we take a good look at this here, we see it's a cam. So this boss here, the boss that runs on the inside of the cocking pivot that's attached to the rifle, is eccentric from the pin axis. If we look here, we see this dimple at the top, which aligns with the furthest point from the cam, so that's top dead center. You see that the dimple there lines up with that perfectly. Now the more we rotate this pin in the rifle, the closer and further we can move the front of the stabiliser to the barrel itself. And depending on the orientation of this dimple here, it dictates how far forward the stabiliser unit actually moves in relation to the block. So if we have the dimple on this side, the stabiliser is moved the furthest amount back in relation to the transfer port, and if we rotate it around like so, with the dimple at the back, it moves it the furthest amount forward. It actually sounds more confusing than it is, so if your rifle isn't aligned perfectly with that little test we done, you can adjust it using the eccentric pin at the back. Although mine was set pretty much perfectly, so I'm just going to leave it where it was, like so. And I'll put the C-clip back on the back. With the stabiliser position set, what we can do now is reinstall the stabiliser brake in the side here, so this part here. First thing we're going to drop in is this little dowel rim piece here, and it has a boss on it, and that goes in first. So dowel rim boss goes in first, and we'll get that in position using a 1.5mm Allen key. The next thing we're going to put in is the little tiny spring. It just drops in the hole, and then finally we're going to cap that off with a grub screw. I'm going to do that up using a 2mm Allen key. And what this little adjustment does is stop the cocking handle from flying open when we pull the trigger. So just a small amount of tension on the side of the stabiliser. So thereabouts feels good to me. You can feel a little piece of resistance as you open and close the arm, but it's not stiff to do so. So I'm quite happy with that there. And there we have it. There's the rifle fully put back together. The last thing I'm going to do is put it over the chrono and make sure that the power is set where it needs to be. So I'll do that very quickly off camera, then we'll get it put back in the stock. Right then, so that's the power set. We're running at about 11.4 with JSB heavies. It's time to reinstall the stock. So what we're going to do is flip the action on its end and then get the front block, so it would be the barrel band, but I've cut that off. So this block here with the front aligned with the stock, slide it over the top like so, then a 3mm Allen key does up the back screw, and a 4mm Allen key does up the front one, just making sure the block is aligned and the screw starts nice and squarely. With both screws started, we can make sure that the stock is in the right position, and then do these two screws up nice and tightly. A 3mm in the back and a 4mm Allen key in the front. Right then, the final thing I just want to mention quickly before we go is that you can adjust the stabiliser when it's in the rifle and in the stock. So if you take it down the range, you get shooting and you notice that the stabiliser weight is a little loose in the back there, all you can do is just take that grub screw out, remove the back cap, and after you've fired the rifle, if you cock the rifle, it will bring the stabiliser out. You can pull it out the back and readjust the little grub screw in the side. What I like to do is I've just set it roughly for now, and when we go down the range what I'll do is my final adjustment. The little roller ball bearing on the side is a fairly coarse adjustment, so you do have to be careful exactly how far in or how far out you do it. If you get it too loose, what will happen is the stabiliser weight will fly back, hit the back cap and cause you some adverse recoil conditions. If it's too tight, what will happen is the stabiliser will absorb the recoil into the rifle and you'll feel the recoil like a standard gun. The ideal setting is with the roller ball bearing just touching the stabiliser so that it's able to move backwards nice and freely, but it's not so free that it hits the back cap. So I always set mine a little loose when we do it on the bench and then do the final testing and sort of setting of the stabiliser weight when we get down the range and I'm behind the rifle. But with that all said and done, that's going to about do it for this one, guys. So thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.